this would never be. So tonight, it looks like we have a small group, but we're interested in hearing what you both have to say, both of our speakers, and this will be recorded so that other people can watch it afterwards, as I think Jessica already said. So we want to welcome Karen Leith from the, she's from the Hudson League, but she's also on the Advocacy Committee of the League of Women Voters and has been working very much with the education bill that was done by Representatives Patterson and Cupp in the last session a couple of years ago. I know she was active in that. Looks like just in reading your intro here that was in our league newsletter, which hopefully the rest of you have read, very active in her local league, very active in the Catholic Commission, working with Catholic Charities in Cleveland. She's evidently has a degree in psychology from Case and also from John Carroll, religious studies also. Work experiences included educator from elementary through college levels in both religious studies and psychology, and worked as a youth minister, pastoral minister, director of social justice, volunteer lobbyist. So a lot of things in her background that certainly make her very well classified to talk about the education situation in Ohio and what the league is doing with it. And we also welcome Kevin Lillie, who is the treasurer CFO of the Geneva Area City School District in Ashtabula County for 28 years. It's a long time. He again was also active in working on the bill with the school funding that we hope is going to work if it's not already working. He worked on the proposed transportation formula changes for the House Finance Subcommittee on Primary and Secondary Education, the House Finance Committee, the Senate Primary and Secondary Education Committee. It sounds like he's done a lot of work on that as far as the with the transportation and the education in the schools. And I think he's been very active. And I know he was working right along with Representative Patterson on all this. So I welcome both of you. We're going to start with Karen, and then Kevin, we're going to ask you to come in afterwards on share whatever you can, and so that we know more what's going on. I know that I've seen, and I'm sure the rest of you have seen, that some concerns now with the State Board of Education, that the legislature has decided that they're not happy with some of the people, I guess, that got elected. Maybe that's the reason, I'm not sure, but anyway, they're talking about kind of overriding the State Board of Education. So I'm going to turn this meeting over to Karen, and you have a chance to say. And thank you for both coming.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mary. Hold it a minute so I can share screen. It was easier for me to do this simply because there is a lot more information on the slides than what I'm going to talk about for the sake of time. But I will send the slides to your league, and you are free to upload them in any way you want. The first thing we will always watch is education finance. This is one of the areas where League of Women Voters has made a huge difference. We've signed on to many amicus briefs. We have helped with the lawsuits over the years, etc. And we actually have a number of league members working with the group that are involved with the voucher lawsuit right now. Our feeling is democracy needs its public schools. It needs strong public schools, and they need to be financed. And so we have an incredible commitment to that. And so it's really, really important. Yes, the Cupp-Patterson formula was passed for this biennium, but it was not fully funded. And we will be starting the budget process all over again with the new biennium, and we will be, fighting hard for the full funding of that. In the meantime, basically, the Universal Vouchers Bill, HB 290, has been introduced in this biennium. It's sometimes referred to as the backpack bill, which, because it would allow money to travel with students. So the money would be hooked to the students and therefore giving them the ability. We're not sure, we're watching this because we're not sure. There is some intel that some form of this might be entered in lame duck. We've been watching lame duck. As you know, we have 1 week of lame duck already under our belt. The General Assembly is off this week for Thanksgiving break, and some of the committees are already starting posting agendas for next week. We understand that basically we have Senate President Huffman, who has vowed he wants some form of financing, especially since he came out of Catholic schools and he wants to make sure people can afford to go to Catholic schools, as he's been quoted in several articles. So there is some intel that some form of this may be passed now, because it's easier to do it now before the budget process starts, so that it can become part of the budget process. So this is one of the pieces we are watching. The other piece we're watching has to do with the fact that we have a great position on high stakes testing. And basically we're looking at the retention part of the 3rd grade reading guarantee. Retention does not work. All the research has shown that it actually makes the whole piece worse. It's kind of interesting because I've had many conversations with my daughter about this. She has been trained as a reading specialist, and she, in the last couple of years, switched to being a math coach. But she is, her original certification was pre-K through 3, and she said, all our testing is wrong. Our testing should be done as a means of looking at what children need to help them learn to read, and that many of our students are in families where the grandparents are taking care of them and don't have the reading ability to help the students. And, you know, she, in her classroom, would find mentors for those students so that they would get the same practice in reading and the same encouragement to move them along. And that retention is not the answer. Tests need to be used as diagnostics, not as punishment. And it lowers a child's self-esteem, which makes trying to learn to read even harder. So this is one we're watching. We're hoping something's going to happen. People have been back and forth on whether it will pass during lame duck or not. The State Board of Education's been trying to move it along because of the most recent research looking at that. I actually listened to the arguments of the State Board on their resolution regarding this. And it was very interesting because one person who actually wants to keep the retention policy was citing the great success in Mississippi. So I went back and did a little research. The great success in Mississippi were the mentoring programs, the use of the diagnostics, and the money poured into literacy programs for children. So that's another bill we are watching. This one is a new one. Pat, I don't even think you've heard us talk about this one. This deals with governance of the role of the State Board of Education. And its bill number is SB 178. And actually, it was originally introduced. If you go to the Ohio legislative website, right now it looks like a very empty bill. It's only 3 or 4 sentences long, basically just saying we have to reform the function. But if you look back to when it was originally introduced, it has a lot to do. It was originally, and it's Renicky again, who has sponsored it. And it has a lot to do with the whole thing of looking at looking through the whole realm of education in terms of workforce development. So when we moved off a board of regents and gave a governor's cabinet level position for higher education, it was expected we would do the same thing. What's dangerous about this bill is it takes away almost it could possibly, we don't know yet exactly what they're going to put in it, but it could possibly take away every power that is not in the Constitution of the State Board of Education. It therefore destroys elements of home rule. It destroys some of the guidance. It would leave the fact they can't get rid of the State Board of Education because by law we need to have elected members of the State Board of Education. And as you know, we also have appointed members, and they cannot take away the fact that the State Board of Education is mandated to hire the next state superintendent. So, but they can remove everything else. So that's what's a little dangerous about this whole movement to put everything under the governor. And this is important to us. We've had some discussions, and I can talk about it at the end, and I'll talk a little bit about as I hit the next set of bills. The fact that as League, we concentrate, and we will be concentrating mostly on the democracy issues, the voting rights issue, the redistricting issue, and the direct democracy issue. But we have made a commitment, and we did this even on Saturday, that we will always work on education finance, and this being a governance issue, this is on our radar. And so we're going to watch this very, very closely. Now, here's where we switch gears a little bit. These are just a sampling, and I'm going to go into a few of these, of the other major education issues. In the General Assembly this biennium, there's been over 125 bills connected to education. Some of the ones that have really made the news are the censorship bills, HB 327, 322, 416. We have seen recently 722, the Parent Bill of Rights, be introduced. You know, early on, we saw 529, the online posting of all materials for all courses. We've seen the General Assembly try to reduce the school board terms of local school boards. And right now, this past Wednesday, was the basically the opposition hearing for HB 454, which is the bill that bans gender affirming care. And if you missed the news, Amy Schneider actually flew in that morning to testify and flew out immediately after. She was raised in Dayton, went to schools in the Dayton-Cincinnati area, and felt it was really important that she say something about it. So that's it general. Okay, the censorship bills are here in front of you. We're not seeing them in committee per se. We also have heard from Matt Huffman that he really has he puts it no stomach for the culture wars. And we're not sure where these are going to go, but we're looking at these, and this is what's important. We're looking at these because parts of them have the ability to be tagged on to other legislation. So essentially, basically a couple of them, 322 and 327, you know, are quote unquote dead as bills, but their concepts are still alive. And they were expanded somewhat in 616, but we haven't seen them in any committees, and we're watching them. I'm going to say this now. This is not something, because we've made a commitment to the financing and the democracy bills. Basically, what we're encouraging leagues to do who want to be active on these is to watch the Honesty for Ohio Education website and to make sure you're on their newsletter. That's one of our coalitions. We're a major member of that coalition. And it allows league members to take action without having the league name out there right now and spread too thin, as we're trying to make our greatest impact on the democracy bills at this point. HB 722 has just been introduced. I find it amazing because I actually went through policies, law, etc. None of this is necessary. It already exists in all our school districts. Parents have the right to be notified, to ask questions, to review materials, etc. What this is, when you start looking at the sponsors of it, is an attempt to come through the back door on the gender affirming care piece and the transgender piece. I find it very interesting, all the time being spent on talking about transgender athletes when we have only one in the whole state. As you know, as leaguers, starting with LWVUS and the fact that as well as our nonpartisan policy is our DEI policy. We will stand up for the rights of every single citizen, no matter who they are. And that's really important. At the national level, LWVUS has signed amicus briefs for 4 different cases involving transgender issues across the country. And it's really important that we do this and make ourselves very clear on this. Again, we're relying on Honesty for Ohio Education to work with this, and Maria Bruno of Equality Ohio has taken the lead on what we're doing within the Honesty Coalition in terms of a lot of these issues. So again, please watch it. This is why League belongs to coalitions, to allow the spreading out of leadership and expertise. Obviously, people there have a lot more expertise in some of that. And what's wonderful about the Honesty for Ohio Education Coalition is the fact that even the teachers' unions, both OFT and OEA, participate in that coalition, as well as some of the organizations for higher education. It is one of the broadest coalitions on education actually in the US. And that's really important to know, and we were key in helping to bring that about. This HB 582, we really don't think it's going to go anywhere. It's in the Government Oversight Committee. They're attempting to reduce local school board terms to 2 years, so that every 2 years you would have a total turnover of school boards. And again, it's basically trying to, in my opinion, trying to exert a lot of, taking away a lot of our home rule and the voice of the citizens in any of our school districts. HB 454, again, the opponent hearing was this past Wednesday. We're watching to see what happens next with it. If anyone understands the law, if anyone understands working with children, it doesn't even make sense no school has the ability to do anything without parental permission that would directly impact the mental health or well-being of our students. That basically, in terms of honoring students, we talk about social emotional learning, and this is respecting the social emotional learning of all our students. That if a family, especially, go back to the Parent Bill of Rights. To me, it's taking away the parents' rights of those children where the families are supportive of the use of alternative pronouns, and the requests for that representation. On the other hand, it also would endanger some of our students. We have families that have the student knows if they're safe at home. The student knows how much they can communicate to their family. And we've got to respect that and be very careful of that. So this is one that we're working through Honesty for Ohio Education on. So if you have members who really want to get involved, again, it's Honesty for Ohio Education. And this is the anti-trans youth in sports. I have to say this as an aside. My youngest grandson, who is 13, almost 14, an 8th grader, plays hockey. He's on in Kent. He's on a Bantam team. 2 of the best players on the team are girls. They're just as good at checking and being checked. One of them is a star goalie on the team. One of them left figure skating to join the team. She finds it more thrilling to play hockey. And when you're getting into the under 14 league, it's tough, it's aggressive, it's physical. And so it really, this bill is making a problem where there is none. The Ohio Athletic Association has rules, has procedures. We have actually at the high school level, one trans youth playing varsity sports. And it's just incredible. And what's horrific about this, although they may amend this bill to take out the genital inspections so that some form of it's passed. So we are watching this. Again, lame duck has not really put its cards on the table. The last week had first hearings for a lot of bills. It was almost, I said to someone, it was almost as if promises had been made for the election and they were making good on their promises of at least hearing the bills. So it's really what we're going to watch is next week as seeing what's going to start moving in lame duck. So with that, I wanted to just do a really overview and open it up for questions and discussion. There's a lot, and I will say this, while we're watching this at the state level, what's even more important is the local level. And across the state, we've been telling local leads to have observer corps, to watch local government, because that's really where we're a home rule state, and that's really where a lot of this needs to play out. And it's going to become very important to be aware of where your community stands, what the policies are, et cetera. And I'm sure Mr. Lillie will back me on that and how important the local school board is and the relationship with the local superintendent. With that, I'll entertain any questions, or we can open it up however you would like to do it.
Does anybody have any questions, or shall we go on and hear what Mr. Lillie has to say and then maybe come up with some questions? Okay, Kevin, if you'd like to go ahead and.
I have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
Karen, this is a whole lot of information. Where do you think we should put our efforts at this point?
At this point, basically, I am going to underscore the fact that pay attention locally, follow honesty for education on those issues, but as leaguers where we need to put our effort, because none of this is going to change unless we work on the redistricting, the voter rights piece, and the direct democracy piece. So that is really going to be important. Pay attention to the fact that 2023 will be a local election year. Know whether you have 2 or 3 school board members up for election, because if you have 3, there's an ability to flip a board. Pay attention to who those candidates are. Start early in the year talking about the issues in your community. Run for informational forums with pros and cons on the issues, so that by the time November comes along, you have an educated community that understands the policies. I always encourage, have excellent relationships with your superintendents in your local school boards. They're extremely important, and be affirming. When they do something right, be affirming. The one thing we always hear is the fact that people show up when they don't like what's happening, but no one shows up when you really like what's happening. And things changed here in Hudson because every school board meeting, they were having to listen to 4 hours of this. We don't want this, and we don't want that, and we want this book banned, and this is horrible that you're teaching this. And then one night, 400 people showed up to give the school board a standing ovation. It just changed everything. It just made everyone stop to think that in fact, we were actually characterizing some of the people. We could identify the people who were there every single school board night talking with comments. We were saying some of them had their uniform. There's white shorts, and there's, we got to know them by that. But when 400 people stood up and told the school board they were doing a good job, it just changed the whole tenor of what was going on and relieved so much tension. And we forget how much our leaders need to hear what's going right. Does that help, Lorna?
Greatly, and not just the school boards, where we need to get more involved, but supporting the teachers in our
Yes.
Local school districts as well. Many of us in this particular league are retired teachers, so we need to pay it forward,
Oh, definitely. Absolutely. It's really the tension in classrooms today is horrific. It's just, and you know, and people are ignoring all the things we've learned over the years, that a child cannot learn if they don't feel safe. A child cannot learn if they're hungry. A child cannot learn if they've experienced trauma. All of these things are really, really important. And one of the best things we did was to focus on social emotional learning and learn about the trauma of some of these children. I even saw it at the college level, and the difference it makes when you pull a student aside and say, hey, I have a feeling you've got it tough right now. How can I help you? You know, that becomes extremely important.
I have a question. I'm a member of an academic booster group at a middle school, high school. And I think that a lot of this information that you presented, which was just absolutely great, I feel that the other members need to know this. But I can also say they cover the entire political spectrum.
Yes.
So what would be a good way to maybe proffer this information without feeling or making them feel like they're getting lectured to or what have you? Any suggestions on how to say, be informed and, you know, without beating them over the head?
That's a dilemma we all have. We're living in new times that are so polarized. And, you know, the recognition we've got to make is you're not going to change the two extremes, whether you have the super understanding extreme or you have the ultra conservative. There's only one way. One thing, a few rules across the board. Don't repeat disinformation. Try and put out good information, but without highlighting the disinformation. There's an awful lot of disinformation out there. Basically, point out some of the things, you know, I sometimes when I travel or I deal with groups that are beyond the state, you know, you meet interesting people and you have interesting discussions. And we were having a discussion of the I Promise School, LeBron James's school in Akron. And it's a public school. It comes under the local school board. But, you know, the way Akron has worked in terms of looking at its neighborhoods and its schools, they were able to put this together in such a way. But what became important is the wraparound services. And, you know, that, and I know that. I came out of college in 1970. Moved, you know, got married that summer. We moved to Chicago, and I was introduced to the poorest of the poor of the Chicago schools. And, you know, my first encounter with this issue was the little girl who only came 3 days a week. And so I called up the social worker and said, I'm really concerned. She misses 3 days a week, every single week. And so the social worker came back to me after doing some research, and she said she needed clothes. The days she couldn't come to school, her clothes were being washed. So the social worker found clothes for her, and then she was never absent. You know, it's looking at what we've learned about the children in front of us. They come from many situations, and sometimes we need to tell stories because stories are easier to get across. And that where we need to do that is with the middle range, where people aren't sure where they are or what the situation is. But when they hear the stories, it makes them think. And, I just love, I keep saying to people, we've got to make, these girls are moving into new realms. They don't only want girls teams. We don't have retiring young ladies who play sports. We've got athletes, and and they compete on a real level, and they want to be recognized as athletes. And asking the question of what would that do to when Title IX's changed a lot in terms of women, and everyone has a right. Team sports are important to our development. Teaches cooperation, teaches, teamwork. So much of our corporations are teamwork now too, learning to work with one another. And if we deny certain segments of our students from that ability, we're denying them part of their education and their social emotional learning also.
Okay, thank you, Karen. Let's turn this over to
Thank you.
Kevin now and see what he has to say, and then there'll be more questions probably.
Okay. Well, so how much time do we have? Are you trying to keep this meeting to an hour?
If it doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter, okay. Well, I believe I was asked to give a presentation on vouchers. And to start off, this may be something you already know, but I just want to read from the Ohio Constitution, Article 6, Education, where they have what is commonly referred to as the thorough and efficient clause. So under school funds, it says the General Assembly shall make such provisions by taxation or otherwise as with the income arising from the school trust fund will secure a thorough and efficient system of common schools throughout the state. But no religious or other sect or sects shall ever have any exclusive right to or control of any part of the school funds of the state. So it says a thorough and efficient system, not multiple systems, basically one system. And I just bring that up because I think that's how I tend, and obviously as a public school administrator, I'm going to be a little biased when it comes to things that take money away from public schools, but I always think that they should be measured by that clause. So Ohio's voucher program has been around for 26 years. Started with legislation enacted by the Ohio legislature in 1995, where they established the Cleveland Scholarship Program, which was one of the first voucher programs in the United States, beginning with the 96-97 school year. This voucher program involved the utilization of public funds to pay for vouchers for qualified students in the Cleveland Municipal School District to attend participating private schools. Because over 80% of the participating private schools had a religious affiliation, the legality of the Cleveland Voucher Program was challenged in court as a violation of the separation of church and state. And after two lower court rulings overturning the Cleveland Voucher Program, in June of 2002, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the legality of the Cleveland Voucher Program. And since that time, 4 additional voucher programs have been created by the Ohio General Assembly. That U.S. Supreme Court was a 5-4 decision in 2002. And it basically, the opinion was that it provides benefits directly to a wide spectrum of individuals defined only by financial need and residence and in a particular school district. So this was the rationalization to allow this to happen even after 2 courts had overturned the voucher program. So this particular voucher program, Cleveland Scholarship Program, began with roughly 2,000 students participating in fiscal year 97, and since has expanded to nearly 4 times that size. There are 7,759 students that were in the Cleveland voucher program in fiscal year 22. So any student entering grades kindergarten through 12th grade living in the Cleveland Municipal School District was eligible to apply for this program. Priority was given to students from lower income households. The Ohio Revised Code also specifies that the maximum voucher amounts in future years will escalate at the rate of increase of the base cost per pupil used in the school funding formula for traditional districts. The second program that began was the Autism Scholarship Program. This program was begun in the 2003-2004 school year, and it allowed parents of students with autism to choose a non-public school or other qualified service provider to implement the child's individualized educational plan, or IEP. Now, effective last year, the maximum amount for that voucher was increased from $27,000 to $31,500, and that amount increased to $32,445 this year, fiscal year 23. The third program begun was the Ed Choice Scholarship Program, which was a performance-based program. So this began in 2005-2006 school year and allowed students who lived in the attendance area of what was considered a low-performing public school the opportunity to attend participating private schools. In its first year, 3,100 students received vouchers to attend private schools through this program. Originally, there was a requirement that Ed Choice voucher students must have attended the low-performing public school in the year prior to receiving the voucher. However, that requirement was loosened as first 9th grade students and then 10th to 12th grade students were exempted, and sibling eligibility was granted regardless of whether the sibling school building was low performance or not. So as with many things that our legislature has done, and I'm specifically referring here to the charter and community school, they start something under one set of guidelines and then quickly open it up and expand it with really no rationalization. Since House Bill 110, the current state biennium budget bill, phased out the requirement of having to have actually attended a low-performing school over a 4-year period. So by the 25-26 school year, no student would be required to have attended a public school in the year prior in order to receive one of these Ed Choice vouchers. So started out as performance-based. They supposedly had to be in the school. Now it doesn't matter, which really means it's not performance-based. Any school, any student going to any school would be eligible. The fourth program, the Ed Choice Expansion Scholarship Program, rather than performance-based, was income-based. So in 2013, the Ed Choice Scholarship Program began. This expansion program differs from the performance-based Ed Choice program because eligibility is based on household income rather than on the academic performance of the student's home school. Initially, all students in families with incomes at or below 200% of the federal poverty level were eligible to receive vouchers that can be used at participating private schools. That has since increased to 250% of the federal poverty level. Students with family income greater than 400% of the FPL are not eligible for this voucher. The Ed Choice Expansion Program was initially structured to add a cohort of kindergarten students each year, but in fiscal year 13, the program was opened up to kindergarten students who were then eligible to continue receiving these vouchers in subsequent years. And in fiscal year 22, the additional group of students will have finished 9th grade. So it's been around that long. And soon eligibility for this program was granted to students in all grades. So they shelved the kindergarten requirement. The Ed Choice Expansion voucher amounts are the same as they are for the Cleveland and Ed Choice voucher program, which are $5,500 for students in grades K to 8 and $7,500 now for students in grades 9 to 12. And then the fifth program, the John Peterson Special Needs Scholarship Program began in the 11-12 school year, providing vouchers to students with disabilities who have IEPs. This voucher program was, the amount was determined by taking a base amount, then adding an increment which varies according to the student's disability type, which is the same way public schools are funded, base amount, and then depending on the severity of the disability, goes from a lower amount for like a speech and hearing impaired student only to a much higher amount for an autistic student. That range through fiscal year 21 was from $7,588 to $27,000. This incremental voucher amount will increase for most disability types. It increased in fiscal year 22 and increase again in fiscal year 23. And the base amount will increase in fiscal year 24 and beyond by the same percentage that the average per pupil base costs for the regular school districts increase. Now, all these voucher programs initially were funded through a deduction method, meaning if you had a voucher student leave a public school district, the public school district received funding for that as resident ADM, and then that money was deducted from that public school district and sent to the private school, parochial school, wherever that voucher student went. Because that voucher amount was almost always larger than the amount of state aid that a public school district received through their state funding, the money that flowed to these other schools actually included local revenue. So local revenue under that elected Board of Education, voted by the voters in that district, flowed out of that district to some school with no fiscal control. Now, this in fiscal year 22, the deduction approach ended with the Fair School Funding Plan. Fair School Funding Plan now has direct funding. So public school students or public school districts such as Geneva are funded directly by the state. Voucher programs are funded directly by the state. Wherever a student goes, the money goes, basically. So that was a change that the Fair School Funding Plan wanted to put in place, because seeing that money come into the district and leave created a lot of animosity between, say, public school districts and these other choices, because you got this money and then it was deducted, and generally more was deducted than what you received from the state. So it just didn't really make a lot of sense. So Karen mentioned the backpack bill, which would do away with some of these scholarship programs, except for the autistic program and the John Peterson program, in favor of basically universal vouchers. The money follows the student. That particular bill is introduced. The summary of that bill was to express the intent of the General Assembly to establish a school funding formula that allows families to choose the option for all computed funding amounts associated with students' education to follow them to the public and non-public schools they attend. I just wanted to share something regarding that from the Representative Reardon McLean, that is the co-sponsor of that bill. And he shared with his colleagues in the House of Representatives a letter that said, "We have now passed a robust school funding overhaul that takes large strides towards identifying costs associated in the education of each Ohio child. This process has worked hard to define the large sums of money required to fairly fund our systems. But as we finalize this process, I believe that there is more for us to accomplish. Not only should we be asking the question of how much money to put into our education system, but also ways we can use that money to improve outcomes for Ohio children. Families often send their children to their local school district because they have no other funded option, and the schools guaranteed to have classrooms full of students lack the incentive to produce higher standards. The COVID-19 pandemic has again exposed problems within our system, as many schools refuse to open full-time to students, despite the evidence that in-person education was safe. Likewise, it seems every day another story comes out of a rural, suburban, or urban school pushing harmful political agendas in the classroom. It is time to fund students, not schools. And so you can see this is the information that the sponsors are sharing with the other members of the House of Representatives. I also wanted to share, this came from a resolution from a public school district in opposition to House Bill 290, the backpack bill. Some of the things that they pointed out in here under their whereases before they took action to oppose it included, in many cases, the vouchers, excuse me, are awarded to students who never attended a public school. Private and charter schools are not held accountable to the same academic or financial standards as the public schools. From 2005 to the current date, and this was December of 21, the National Assessment of Educational Progress showed scores that were no different from public, private, or charter schools. And many students who receive a voucher show a decrease in state test scores during the first 3 years following the transfer to that other school with the voucher. In many cases, the operators of the private/charter schools are driven by profit motives and not educational improvement. And the impact of the backpack bill on the future of the Fair School Funding Plan is unknown, but it would no doubt be detrimental to further phase in of the plan. So no matter how you look at it, direct funding or the prior method of funding, there's always going to be a pot of money. Prior to the Fair School Funding Plan, schools were funded what we called on a residual basis. Generally, the state took care of everything else in their budget, and then what was left, they backed into a per pupil funding amount, and that's how they came up with $5,900, $6,000, $6,020 per student, and figured out how they were going to fund schools. The Fair School Funding Plan was the first plan to really look at what is needed for the education of the whole student. Things in the Fair School Funding Plan are being funded that were never funded before. Mental health, dollars that would include a funding of a school resource officers, licensed social workers, additional guidance counselors, extracurricular activities that are all part of a well-rounded education, never funded before, and there's funding included. But when it came to funding, the base funding amount based on the number of students in that school, based on the number of students in each grade level, and looking at how many teachers are needed based on per pupil, teacher pupil ratios, and then applying in every case of this funding formula, actual data such as the average salary of teachers when it comes to funding the teachers needed to educate those students directly. The superintendent, every district needs a superintendent. This is required in the Ohio Revised Code. Every district is required to have a superintendent, a treasurer, and then obviously most schools are going to have a principal, some assistant principals, custodial, and housekeeping, transportation. So every aspect is funded based on the average salary of that. So it's the first funding formula that really had any rationale. And as Karen said, yeah, it was only put in this biennium bill and funded basically as part of a 6-year phase-in, 1/6 at a time. So right now we're at 33 1/3. The hope was that it would further be phased in the next 2 bienniums, or based on the overall health of the budget right now, it could really be fully funded right now if the legislature chose. But I think we've been dealt a big blow in that the next Speaker of the House, unfortunately, is not somebody that has really been in favor of the Fair School Funding Plan, let alone public schools. My understanding was when they first took the vote for the next Speaker of the House, the gentleman that had the most votes from Gallia County was a sponsor and voted yes when House Bill 305 hit. As Karen mentioned, lame duck. in the last lame duck 2 years ago, House Bill 305 had been proposed, which basically was the Fair School Funding Plan. The House overwhelmingly approved it by an 87-9 vote. But after testimony to the Senate Finance Committee, they decided they didn't want to take it any further because they didn't think they had the time to vet it, but they figured they could have the time to vet it in the budget process. And if you have any understanding of how the budget process works, there's not much time to vet anything. It's a rush. Governor introduces his budget, it goes through the House, it goes through the Senate, goes through conference committee, and things are stuck in by amendments many times during that conference committee. The time to vet it was prior to the budget process, and that attempt was made. But fortunately, it ended up getting in through the budget process. But our hope surely is that it will continue. We think it has, they want to talk about accountability, and there should always be an accountability piece. But they have never adequately funded schools, public schools. And now that we're moving toward adequate funding, there are many things attacking that to take it away. And the person, Marion, who is going to be the new Speaker of the House, has introduced much legislation to take away even local property taxes, not allowing districts to challenge complaints or introduce complaints when they see a business, say, get a favorable tax valuation well below. But he has been so anti-school that I'm worried right now as we gear up for the next budget process to present testimony. Before, we had two great champions in the House, Speaker, and prior to him becoming Speaker, Rep. Bob Cupp and Rep. John Patterson, truly bipartisan effort. And they truly cared about education. And they are the ones that brought together superintendents and treasurers from around the state, charging them with putting this program together, something that made sense, something that was defensible, and to help get that passed. What started out as a 6-month commitment, according to John, has now turned into over 5 years of work. So we continue to try to get favorable legislation to adequately and equitably fund schools in Ohio.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you just give us a rough estimate of how much money is lost, like say just in Geneva School District, to vouchers to students going other places? And
yes, I can, because the direct funding obviously changed. Districts are required to do a 5-year forecast every year. And the direct funding had a big impact on 5-year forecasts. In our case, we lost $1.7 million under the deduction method in the previous year prior to direct funding to open enrollment, which schools haven't contested, open enrollment where a student goes from one public school to another public school. But I'm including open enrollment, our charter school deduction, and the different vouchers. We had an autism voucher, John Peterson, and the Ed Choice vouchers. $1.7 million left Geneva schools. In the state, all those voucher programs in fiscal year 2022, over $565 million left, or well, 22 was direct funding, but let's say $565 million went to those 5 different voucher programs. Since the inception of the Cleveland voucher program in 1997, over $3.7 billion has flowed from public schools to these other schools. So again, I go back to that thorough and efficient clause, a thorough and efficient form of public schools. How does money going to a private school fit that? How does money going to a parochial school fit that? To me, it doesn't. And I was surprised, when the US Supreme Court stepped in. I mean, it's always been my feeling that it should be unconstitutional. But it's, as decided by the courts, it's not.
Yeah. So
Are
what-
those figures you just quoted for the state
State of Ohio, yes.
billion?
Since the inception in 1997 of that first voucher program through fiscal year 22, ending June 30th, 22, $3.7 billion have flowed to these 5 voucher programs.
Remarkable.
So that 97 with the Cleveland voucher program started as 2,930,000. And then, as I said, fiscal year 22 with all 5 voucher programs, over $565 million. And some schools are hit harder than most. Being familiar with Ashtabula County, Ashtabula is hit heavily. Of course, they have a lot of students leaving via open enrollment. And, I mean, I understand why they look at things, voucher programs, school choice. They obviously are looking at public schools and they're saying that they're failing. But that's not necessarily the case, as that one resolution pointed out, saying that there's been no difference in test scores. But the legislature pushed charter schools. And if you examine those charter schools information, I don't know if it's still available on the Ohio Department of Education website, because a lot of times they'll take information away that doesn't paint a good picture. But they used to put up performance rankings, part of the report card, when they had indicators and a performance ranking. There were over 300 charter schools, and 90% of those charter schools they call them community schools, but there's really nothing community about them. 90% performed at the D and F level. Now, public schools, 70% performed A to C, and 30% performed D to F, which more D than F. The number of districts in F were small, but you had things there like Youngstown City, Cleveland City, East Cleveland schools. And obviously, when you talk report cards, if you look at the demographics, if you look at a map that charts out wealth, it's very obvious that the schools that have always performed well on the state report card are wealthier districts. Poorer districts, low median income, poverty levels struggle to perform. And a lot of that is indicative of the children that you're working with. I mean, Ashtabula deals with, my wife is a teacher in Ashtabula. A lot of their parents are in jail. They're raised by the mom, the father's in jail, and in other cases, the mom's in jail. There's no discipline at home. So how easy is it to discipline in school or control these kids in school? It just is very difficult. And obviously the whole COVID thing hasn't helped that, made it even worse. And so, teachers really struggle in the classroom, but this is what they have to work with. And rather than penalizing them and taking money away, we think that the Fair School Funding Plan goes a long way to getting money to the districts that they need. And then it is up to them to use it wisely to try to improve student outputs, to get results.
Well, certainly was higher figures than I had thought. Are more and more kids leaving the public schools? Do you see it increasing?
These numbers have grown every year as different scholarships were introduced. I mean, when you look at the Cleveland Scholarship Program, that was by itself for what, 7, 8 years. And then the Autism Scholarship was introduced. So with the 5 different programs, once they were all on board, which was 2014, the numbers went from 174.8 million in 2014 to the 565 million in 2022. So yes, they've grown. I mean, obviously you see a lot of advertising, and this is a sad thing, especially charter schools. Public schools don't really make campaign contributions. We're not allowed to take state funding or local taxpayer funding and give it to politicians to get favorable legislation. But it's very obvious, and it's been well reported by groups like the Ohio Coalition for Adequacy and Equity, that charter schools, especially the for-profit ones, a large part of their budgets have gone to campaign contributions, have gone to large amounts of administration, have gone to management companies and school supply companies that come under the same, say, family umbrella, to where very little is used. And you'll see one of the arguments in the backpack bill or so on is they're saying that not a adequate percentage of money flowing to public schools is used for the direct education or instructional component of the students. And I don't know if you look at a charter school, obviously you're probably familiar with ECOT, and before they were put out of business, they basically were saying that students at ECOT were only logging on 1 hour of an instructional day. And they were responsible basically for them being educated for 6 hours. And they were then taking money away from ECOT because they weren't using that money to educate the students, not making sure that they were getting their education. And that is a case where the gentleman that was behind ECOT, millions of dollars flowed in campaign contributions to both Republican, Democratic senators and House, basically to get favorable legislation. And so it's sad to me to see education become such a political piece. It shouldn't be that. If the legislature is intent on making sure what's best for Ohio students, then they shouldn't be taking campaign contributions from anybody to make legislation that favors one type of educational delivery system over another.
Any other questions to either Karen or Kevin?
I'm going to make a comment that supports what Kevin's saying. When we were working on the concurrence on the league charter school position, we had a lot of conversations with David James, the then superintendent of the Akron Public Schools. And he talked about how the charter schools would lure students away with gifts, fancy backpacks and things. And 3 months later, those students were bouncing back into the public schools and usually had lost ground. And he said, it puts an incredible burden on the public school systems. Also, in terms of children that need remedial help or need evaluation, the public schools need to pick up the whole cost and do that evaluation, not the charter schools, not the private schools. And so you've got even more money flowing out of public schools to support these kids in these schools. Interesting thing too, Akron, and it was before David became the superintendent of Akron, and I'm trying to remember if it might have been under Sylvester Small. Akron was doing an assessment of some of their problem students, and they had started an online charter school that was a public school. And it was before the General Assembly made it possible to have these charter schools. And it was under the local school board. They had done it in partnership with the union. They basically, some of the best teachers in the system volunteered to switch over. They were public school teachers, therefore covered by the public school union, et cetera. And it was doing really well in handling some of the problems. When the bill went through the General Assembly establishing charter schools, they had to give it up. It had to become a private entity. All of a sudden, everything changed. You didn't have the quality teachers, you didn't have the monitoring of the students and the commitment for those students to stay online, et cetera. And the local school board lost any governance over the school.
I have a question for Kevin. You talked about the autism voucher program, and you mentioned something about 27,000 per student.
That's correct.
And this is for 1 year?
Yes. That was increased in fiscal year 22. It was increased from 27,000 to 31,500. And then this year, that amount went up to 32,445. Now, there are students in Ohio schools that can cost as much as $100,000 to deliver their education. This is because they have to be in special units. And I mean, there are autistic behavior units. I mean, we are talking about students that are transported to school in van, and they might be kicking seats out in the van and injuring aides. So you're paying for special transportation, you're paying for a special classroom, you're paying for aides during the transportation and in the classroom, and it mounts up to $100,000. And there are other funding sources to help public schools. There's what's called a catastrophic cost calculation that's done on high-cost students that are residents of a public school district, and that is funded by the state. It's never been fully funded. Actually, currently it's funded at about, I think, 37% of what a school district would actually be eligible for, according to the formula that was set up. So you're eligible for one amount, you get 37% of that. And that is the excess over this, about 32,000 for an autistic student, and it's about 27,800 for the other disability categories.
So, okay, so this autistic student is going to like a special school, and so then, say Geneva schools would then need to, or somehow there would be this 27 or now 32,000 that would be going to the special autistic school. Now, if the students stayed in Geneva school system, is Geneva able to provide that education, and would they get that same type of money to do that?
Well, in many cases with these vouchers, the vouchers have actually been more than the state funding that the public school district receives. But public school districts do get additional funds for special education. There are special education weighted funding that's delivered for the different disability codes, and autistic is the higher one. Mm-hmm. So yes, Geneva schools can serve these students. We have for a long time had DD units, what we call DD satellites. They were, when the board of DD was serving in Ashtabula County, K to 12 students, we had 3 DD satellites, one at an elementary school, one at a middle school, one at a high school. And many times those were serving autistic students. We also had a program called Building Bridges that was run through the Ashtabula County Educational Service Center. and had an
Right.
autistic unit and an ED and a behavior unit serving those kids. So we currently have numerous, our building bridges are now in-house. We run those with school district employees rather than going through the SC. And the DD, when they decided no longer to serve these students, the ESC stepped in and helped. And now we have DD units through the ESC, and we've increased actually to 4. So we are serving numerous autistic students, but we also have certain cases where we don't have a good fit for that student. To say the best fit is not in one of these units, and we send them out to highly specialized units through the ESC of Western Reserve or the ESC of Northeast Ohio, which is in Cleveland. They have some really good units. There's also a re-education school in Perry that we send kids to, so we have to transport them there, but it's determined to be the best fit for their particular situation.
So I guess in one way, one of my ultimate questions is the education of the student through these things you've mentioned through the public system comparable to what they would be getting in one of these private voucher programs?
Well, that's hard to say. I can tell you in a number of cases, those vouchers flow to these private or parochial schools, and they're not getting any specialized services. A lot of these vouchers go to St. John, and St. John is, a very small school, not really equipped with special ed units.
Right. I know about.
So there are
definitely.
cases where the money is flowing for the special ed weight or the special ed voucher through John Peterson or autism scholarship, going to schools where the students actually aren't getting the service. But I guess the parents must be happy with that student being in that environment. And so nothing is said, but we've heard many reports where they're actually not getting the services that they would, specialized services that they would get in one of these units. But, efforts in all of these units are usually made to get them exposed to the typical students as well. We have a handicapped preschool in Geneva, and beginning, unfortunately, the year that COVID hit, 1920, we began taking typical students so that we would have typical preschool students, in the classroom with the handicapped preschool students. Right. And then that kind of blew up during COVID because people didn't want their kids in there. And so now it's coming back. And I think we currently have 9 typical students in with our handicapped preschool students. The same thing's done with the units at the elementary, the middle school, and the high school. Trying to get them exposed. They might take a gym class with regular students or so on. And it all, of course, depends on the severity of the disability.
So with an autistic student going to a private school, is the parent then the one that holds the ultimate say as to whether it's an acceptable education? I mean, I'm trying to think how isn't their progress measured somehow, or wouldn't they have an IEP if they're going to the private school?
Yeah, any special education.
How's the accountability with the private school then?
Well, what I'm saying is there's not necessarily some financial accountability saying that voucher money is being used for specialized educational services according to IEP. But yes, every student that is identified as special education is supposed to have an IEP. And it's not only the parent, but generally the state has assigned advocates, to advocate for that child and the family. So there are things in place that are saying, yeah, they're supposed to be getting these services as outlined in that plan. But when I'm hearing that kids are going to St. John where they don't have a unit, and this was coming to me from our special education director saying there's no way they're getting these services there, then I'm just saying, or I guess I'm assuming that then the parents must be happy with their placement in that environment even though they might not be getting the services outlined in an IEP. I don't know that for sure,
Mhm.
but I'm just saying, I know that there are cases reported where, yes, vouchers were flowing to schools, private or parochial, where they weren't equipped with specialized units and licensed special education teachers to work with these kids. So the question would be, well, how are they getting these services outlined in an IEP?
Right, and I guess, well, and I guess looking at it as a taxpayer, I mean, some of the whole public funding for private schools is a little confusing to me because I kind of always looked at it as that was a choice parents made. If they wanted their child to go to a specific private school, then they elected to pay that cost for that. Now, I know in Cleveland with, yes, the concerns with some of the public schools and the low income students, I think it was again an attempt, I guess, to try to make things maybe a little more equitable. But I guess I'm trying to understand a little bit, do we actually have a way of holding the charter or the private schools accountable for, I guess, giving us, I mean, actually providing the services for that they're getting the money for? I mean, how does that work? And I see Karen is nodding no, that
Yeah,
apparently they're
I don't
not.
believe that that's just it.
Okay,
Yeah.
Outside, public school districts are very accountable.
oh, yeah,
And we
Yeah.
have so many different accountability, both on the educational side and the financial side. We're audited every year by the state auditor. When this money flows to charter schools, private schools, and parochial schools, that accountability is lost. Now, as you mentioned, yeah, I would agree. There has always been a level of choice in Ohio. You could send your student to the local public school. You could choose to go to a private school, parochial school, or you could choose to homeschool.
Yeah.
But what they're pushing now is to have those choices funded. So before, yes, if you chose to take your kid to Gilmore Academy or University School in Cleveland, you paid the tuition.
right,
Now we want public tax dollars. And before direct funding, it was both local and state tax dollars going to fund that private education or that parochial education. Or even if you're homeschooled with this backpack bill, you get these credits and you use these to purchase your materials or whatever else. And then if you don't use them, half of that money can go with the student, say, when they go to college, and the other half would go back into the general revenue fund of the state. So it is setting up a situation where money is going to private schools, for-profit charter schools, parochial schools, with no control, no accountability.
Additionally, and this is the possibility, if something like the back universal vouchers passes, you're going to see these small schools springing up all over the place. There's basically a group called Likewise Academy that is trying to push this with, in the Columbus area, outside the Columbus area, whereby parents therefore can choose the local little school that suddenly springs up in their church, with no accountability. And if you even go back to the league position on charter schools, that's one of the things we push for, is if you're going to allow charter schools, accountability is essential.
yeah,
You may have heard, if you've talked about charter schools over the years, I mean, at one point, Ohio was considered the wild, wild west of charter schools. And this was because of the lack of accountability. I believe that the number of schools at that time had grown to over 500 charter schools. And as I said, now it's down closer to 300 because Ohio did finally adopt some accountability measures. They didn't go far enough, but you saw a school open up and it never provided education to anybody. Money flowed to them that they never had to pay back, and they would close and then they would find a new sponsor and open up under another name. And it just went like that. It was like a shell game. And some of the accountability tried to stop that. And those accountability measures are what caused them to go after ECOT, to prove that kids are getting the 6 hours of work that they're supposed to. And it was only found to be that 1 hour. And when that happened and they started asking for money back, then ECOT just closed their doors. Now they never had to pay back. Well, they're supposed to have paid back, and that money was supposed to make its way back to the public schools that lost, which would be probably most of the public schools in the state of Ohio. But we've never seen a dime of that money back.
Okay.
We've gone about an hour and a half now, and I think probably it's about as much as at least my brain can absorb tonight. Unless anybody has a really urgent question they want to ask either Karen or Kevin.
I do. I would
Yes,
like them.
yes.
I would like just maybe each speaker to kind of wrap up, and because we've seen the divestment in public education, not just at K through 12, but at higher education as well. And I'm in higher education in state at Kent State, and so I see it. We see it with our students as well. Can you just speak to and close us out? Maybe I want to say a little positive, but what can be done? Because this divestment has been 30 years in the making. But right now we're coming to a kind of a pinnacle. And so is that okay, Mary? Give them a couple minutes to kind of just wrap it up, and please
Sure.
have something positive. I'm looking for that.
My biggest point is going to be, unless we change the system we're using in Ohio, unless we do something about redistricting and direct democracy and give citizens back their voice, this is going to continue. We have and we do have a voice. And one of the things as leaguers, this has been our mission from the very beginning, and we have made a difference over the years, and we're not afraid of the litigation necessary to make that difference. So use your voice, use your voice.
I would just piggyback on that voters need to be educated. For a long time, I was spoiled. We had great representation at the state level for 8 years with John Patterson being our rep, and even with Sean O'Brien, the state senator from Bezetta Township down near Cortland. Now the reps we have are all about school choice, both State Senator O'Brien and obviously Rep Fowler Arthur. She had never set foot into a public school until she was on the State Board of Education already. And she came and visited Geneva, went around with our superintendent at the time, Mary Zappatelli. And when she heard the bell ring in that school, she freaked out. She had never heard a school bell before, and she didn't know what it was. And we have to get people in the legislature that are going to make, rational, well-thought decisions for Ohio Ohio school children, period. And I agree. I think Karen had said earlier about democracy. It's well served in the public school setting. It's not necessarily well served in different private schools, and especially charter schools, especially when you have a Turkish cleric who is banished from Turkey, holed up in Saylorsburg, Pennsylvania, opening charter schools in Ohio, especially down in Dayton, and doing all kinds of things that are more trying to recruit fanatics to go over and promote the overthrow of the Turkish government than to give them a good education.
Well, thank you. I think this gives us a lot to think about and to be responsible for. We need to be responsible voters. We need to encourage others. So we certainly thank you both for all the time, not only here tonight, but for the time you put into all this over the years, the work and everything. So with that, I think we'll close out and say thank you and have a good Thanksgiving.
Thank you,
Yeah.
you too.
Okay, thank you very
too
much.
For having us.
Yes.
Yeah,
Thank
it
you
was
both.
wonderful. Thank you.
And if you don't know, Cindy Nagy is my cousin, so please don't hold that against her.
Right.
Very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank